Okay, now we're on chapter 2 of Church of the East, which is entitled Persecution. Okay, so in the early days of the church, persecution strengthened the missionary activity of the Church of the East. It is said that during the reign of the Roman Emperor Decius, this is about 249 AD, a great multitude of Christians were cut off by various punishments and sufferings in a persecution more cruel and terrific than any that had preceded it. Immense numbers being dismayed not so much by the fear of death as by the dread of long-continued tortures professed to renounce Christianity. In the time of the Roman Empire Diocletian, which is in 303-304, there were insurrections in Syria and Armenia, which were blamed on the Christians, and many excellent men were sentenced either to capital punishment or condemned to the mines. Some became apostate, but others, particularly those in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, saved themselves by crossing the border into Persia, where they were sure of a welcome by their fellow Christians. Apostate means they renounced Christ. Unfortunately, it was not long before persecution broke out against the Church of the East. And by the time of Sapor II's reign, 339 to 379, the Roman Empire had become officially Christian. Roman Empire Constantine even claimed a sort of protectorate over all Christians, and he wrote to Sapor II asking protection and favor for the Christians residing in Persia. Unfortunately, Constantine's request had the opposite effect that he desired. Since the Persian and the Roman empires were almost constantly at war, Sapor II was naturally suspicious of anyone who espoused the Roman faith. After all, they might be spies in the pay of the Romans. This suspicion increased since the Christians in Persia, even those who spoke Persian, used Syriac in their church services. Eventually, the Sapor II issued a firman, F-I-R-M-A-N, one word, not a command, but permission to act. It released all the radical hatred and fanaticism which had previously been held in check. The first firman ordered all Christians to pay double tax as a contribution to the cost of the war. The firman ordered the Catholicos to collect the amount. When the Catholicos, which was like the Catholic leadership, refused to do this on the grounds that his people were too poor to pay, and besides he was not a tax collector, the king ordered him arrested and all the Christian churches destroyed. Before the king, the Catholicos was offered freedom for himself and his people if he would only worship the sun once. He remained firm, and on the morning of the first day of the feast of unleavened bread in the year AD 339, along with 5 bishops and 100 minor clergy, they sealed their testimony with blood. The farewell blessing of the Catholicos had been handed down to us in these words, and this is the quote: "May the cross of our Lord be the protection of the people of Jesus. May the peace of God be with the servants of God, and establish your hearts in the faith of Christ, in tribulation and in ease, in life and in death, now and forevermore." While the martyrdom of these men took place, one of those under condemnation, seemed to waver. When he saw the sword about to fall, he trembled and he looked as if he might yield. At this moment, a high official in the palace called out from amidst the crowd, "Do not be afraid, Hananiah. Shut your eyes a little that you may open them on the light of Christ." Immediately the guards seized this official and dragged him to the palace before the king. Sapor II, angry at the intervention of this nobleman, asked, "Have I not given you work to do? Why then do you ignore my orders and stay to look at the punishment of these good-for-nothings?" The man replied, "Would to God that my work might increase through their idleness, and that my life might be changed by their death. As for the work you have given me to do, I esteem it not because it is full of cares, and I value the punishment to which you have condemned them because it is full of joy." Furious, the king replied, "You ask death in place of your work? You wish to be treated like them?" The man answered, "I am a Christian. I believe in their God. That is why I envy their punishment and despise your dignity." The king cried out, "May he not die like the others, but because he has despised my majesty and has spoken with me as an equal, seize his tongue and tear it out by the roots through his throat, so that those who are living may fear me because of him." The guards carried out the orders of the king and put the Christian to death most cruelly. The Christians had more problems with the Persians than merely generating suspicion and fear. The Christians' habits and customs offended the Persians because of some irritating differences. 2 actions particularly repugnant were the Christian practice of burial of the dead and their view that celibacy was a superior way to live. There was little hope for peaceful cohabitation. The main persecution beyond financial hardship began with an indiscriminate massacre of Christians around the Persian capital. It lasted 2 weeks. At any time, petty officials such as the village head could arrest or imprison the followers of Christ. Any man of any position could examine the Christian and put them to death. Sometimes they did this without examination. However, not all governors were hostile to the Christians in their region. Bishops were especially the objects of persecution. Some were stoned by renegade Christians who hoped thereby to save their own lives. Also executed within a period of 6 years were 2 successors of the Catholicos. On the occasion of the end of the war, the defeated Romans handed over 5 provinces containing a largely Christian population to Sippor II. As a condition of peace, he deported the Christians to distant provinces of Persia with orders issued to deal severely with all the deportees who would not abandon Christianity. For example, he gave one group of 300 Christians the choice of apostasy or death. Only 25 people chose life on earth. The others chose life eternally and were martyred. He treated other groups of Christians similarly. The martyrs were not only men, some were women. The queen, and they're going to provide a bunch of other examples of persecution that are a little bit gruesome. Okay, Sippor died in 379, and his brother Ardashir succeeded him and reigned 4 years, and the persecution continued. And then Bahram V came to power in AD 420, and a terrible persecution broke out all over the Persian Empire. And one bishop reported, "It is not easy to describe the new kinds of punishment that the Persians invented to torment the Christian. They flayed the hands of some and the backs of others. They stripped the skin of their face. It was just really bad." According to reports, Bahram V drove many Christians out of Persia, pillaging their houses and taking their possessions, seizing properties. There's 3 martyrs that stood out for their persecution, and one was called Hormisdas, another was called St. James, the cut in pieces, and then there was that of James the Notary. So these are all people that had incredible persecution for their Christianity. So when the summer was over, Bahram V began the journey to his winter palace, and an informer told the king that the constancy of the Christian captives encouraged other Christians and prevented their apostasy, and so none denied their faith. "What more can I do to them?" said the king. "Their goods have been confiscated, their houses have been sealed, and they themselves have been tortured." And then the informer says, would that your majesty would command me without blows and without murder to make them apostatize. He said that they could, but you could not put them to death. The informer stripped them, bound their hands behind their backs, and ordered them to be taken each night to a desert palace in the mountains where they were laid on their backs and given only a little bread and water. After they had undergone these tortures for a week, the informer called the guard and asked where the miserable Nazarenes were. "And they are very near death," replied the guard. "Go and tell them," he said, "that the king orders them to obey his wish and to worship the sun. If not, I shall put cords on their feet and will have them dragged all through the mountains until their flesh shall separate from their bones, so that their bodies will remain among the stones, and only the tendons attached to the skin will be left." The guards carried out the instructions. Some Christians were unconscious. Others, overcome by pain, renounced Christ. The governor loosed them without compelling them to worship the sun or the fire and led them back to Seleucia. When they had recovered from their wounds, they fasted, wept, and prayed for their apparent defection. James the Notary remained strong in his faith, though. He returned to his duties and reported to the bishops that what was said in the palace and what Bahram V meditated against the Christians. He tried to encourage and to comfort. When he later learned that in the court he was considered as having apostatized with his fellow servants, he returned to town, clothed himself with sackcloth, covered himself with ashes, and dedicated himself in penitence. Later, an informer saw James reading the book of the Gospels. The informer assembled the 16 confessors. Questioning the first 15, he asked that they had not recanted and carried out his wishes. They replied, "We have lost the life which you have asked of us once. Do you ask us to apostatize a second time?" The informer released them and sent them to their homes. Then he addressed James and said, "As for you, have you not denied the faith of the Christians?" And James said, "I never did deny the faith, and nor do I intend to do so. It is the faith of my fathers." On hearing this, the informer condemned James to the punishment of the 9 deaths. And he cut off pieces of his body one by one. Oh, it's just awful. Not all Christians imitated the courage of these heroes. Many fled or remained hidden. Officially, the persecution ceased in the year AD 422, when peace between the Romans and Persians was established. In AD 438, Bahram died, and his son Yezdegerd II succeeded him. Initially, he was favorable to Christians, but then intense persecution broke out about a decade later. One enormous massacre killed 10 bishops and 153,000 others on a mound outside the city. The followers, let's see. There were some that were driven from the empire and they emigrated rather than deny their faith, and they brought craftsmanship and missionary zeal into their countries of refuge. Like the Huguenots, and those of you who were in my class last year, we read the one story about the Huguenots who brought the silk trade to England. Like the Pilgrim Fathers who carried the Puritan energy out of England, these Christians came to Mesopotamia with the best of the artisan class, carpenters, smiths, weavers. And they were not merely exiles, they were missionaries. As one historian notes, at home they were denounced as heretics. Abroad, they simply journeyed as enthusiastic missionaries of the gospel. They were remarkably successful in winning converts in the places they went. As a result, the Persian church changed in two major ways. First, the increase in numbers and the zeal and devotion of men who were exiles for their faith stimulated the churches and made them greater centers of missionary propaganda. Second, their arrival led to a change of policy toward the Christians on the part of the Persian government. Previously, if the government changed its policy, Christians were worse off. For example, the myriad of martyrs killed under Sapor II. This time, though, the change of policy was for the best. The Persian kings had been inclined to look upon the Christians as allies of their Roman enemies. Now, though, these exiles were no longer in communion with Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, or Alexandria. Obviously, they no longer presented a political threat to Persia. When a high-ranking dignitary of the church represented their bishop as a friend of Persia, Pyrrhus, the Persian king, decided to give preference to the victims and enemies of the Romans. He thought that such a policy would secure the faithfulness of his Christian subjects. And so the Persian kings and the Church of the East drew together in self-defense against attacks from the Romans. The original Christians joined hands with the newcomers. So they've got some stability right now as they are joining hands to fight the Romans. And that is the end of chapter 2.